The wind howled through the mountain pass like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the scent of snow and something darker. Elizabeth Murphy pressed herself against the rough bark of a pine tree, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps that clouded the frigid air. Behind her, she could hear them coming. The villagers, the ones who had cast her out with stones and curses, calling her barren, worthless, a blight upon their community. Her hands trembled as she clutched the small bundle that contained everything she owned in this world, a pitiful collection of worn clothing and a single photograph of the husband who had abandoned her when the doctor pronounced his verdict. The forest around her seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Every shadow held the promise of wild animals or worse, the men who might still be pursuing her with their torches in their righteous anger. She had run for hours, her feet bleeding through her thin shoes, her dress torn by brambles and branches that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. The temperature was dropping fast, and she knew that without shelter, she would not survive the night. The irony was not lost on her that a woman deemed incapable of bringing life into the world would die alone in these mountains, her body becoming food for the creatures that called this wilderness home. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs. She pushed away from the tree and stumbled forward, deeper into the darkness, her eyes straining to make out the treacherous path ahead. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, offering no guidance, no comfort. She was truly alone now, more alone than she had ever been in her 28 years of life. The village that had been her home since birth was gone to her forever, as unreachable as the stars above. The people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow and marry and hope for children that would never come, had turned their backs on her with a cruelty that still took her breath away. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. Elizabeth's foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling forward onto the frozen ground. Pain shot through her palms as they scraped against the rough earth, and she tasted blood where she had bitten her tongue. For a moment, she lay there in the dirt and dead leaves, overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. She was a woman alone in the wilderness with winter approaching, no skills for survival, no knowledge of how to find food or build shelter. The villagers had been right about one thing: she was useless. But as she lay there, feeling the cold seeping through her clothes and into her bones, something inside her rebelled against that thought. She would not die here like a wounded animal. She would not give them the satisfaction of being right about her worthlessness. With great effort, Elizabeth pushed herself to her feet and continued walking. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees and shadows that all looked the same in the darkness. Her legs ached, her lungs burned with the cold air, and her stomach cramped with hunger. She had not eaten since the morning of her eggs, and that had been nothing more than a crust of bread and weak tea. The bundle in her arms seemed to grow heavier with each step, but she clutched it tighter, knowing it was all she had left of her former life. Then, through the trees ahead, she saw it, a flicker of orange light, warm and inviting against the blue-black darkness of the night. A fire, which meant shelter, and shelter meant the possibility of survival, but it also meant people, and people might mean danger. Elizabeth hesitated, weighing her options. She could continue wandering through the forest until exhaustion or cold claimed her, or she could approach the light and hope that whoever had built that fire possessed more mercy than the villagers who had driven her out. The decision was made for her when her legs simply gave out. She collapsed to her knees, her bundle spilling open and scattering her few possessions across the forest floor. Her wedding dress, the one she had worn with such hope and joy, lay crumpled among the dead leaves like a discarded dream. The photograph of her husband fluttered in the wind, his stern face looking up at her with the same disappointment she had seen there in life. She gathered her things with numb fingers, knowing that she had no choice now but to seek help from whoever tended that fire. As Elizabeth approached the source of the light, she could make out the shape of a cabin nestled in a small clearing. It was larger than she had expected, built from logs that had been carefully fitted together and chinked with what looked like clay and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and golden light spilled from windows that had been covered with what appeared to be oiled paper rather than glass. It was crude but solid, the kind of dwelling that spoke of someone who knew how to live in this harsh environment. She crept closer, staying in the shadow of the trees, and she is trying to get a glimpse of whoever lived in this remote place. Through one of the windows, she could see the silhouette of a man moving about inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements economical and purposeful. Even from a distance, there was something about his bearing that suggested strength and competence. This was not a man who would be easily intimidated or swayed by the opinions of others. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, paralyzed by indecision and fear. What if he turned her away? What if he was worse than the villagers who had exiled her? Stories of mountain men were common in the settlements, tales of willed, dangerous individuals who lived outside the boundaries of civilized society. Some were said to be criminals fleeing justice. Others were described as half-mad hermits who had forgotten how to interact with other human beings. But as the cold continued to seep into her bones and her strength continued to ebb, Elizabeth realized she had no choice. She stepped out of the tree line and walked slowly toward the cabin, her footsteps crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. Before she could reach the door, it opened, and the man she had seen through the window emerged. In the firelight that spilled from the doorway behind him, she could see that he was younger than she had expected. Perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and a beard that was neatly trimmed despite his isolated lifestyle. His clothes were rough but clean, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who was completely at home in this wilderness. "You're hurt," he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, lacking the harsh edge she had expected from a mountain man. His eyes took in her torn dress, her bleeding hands, the way she swayed on her feet from exhaustion and cold. "Please," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have nowhere else to go." The man studied her for a moment, and she prepared herself for rejection, for the door to be slammed in her face as it had been in the village. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "Come inside before you freeze to death," he said simply. The warmth of the cabin hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, and she stumbled as her frozen limbs began to thaw. The man caught her arm, steadying her, and she was surprised by the gentleness of his touch. The interior of the cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and simple but well-made furniture arranged around the room. Everything was clean and orderly, not at all what she had expected from a hermit's dwelling. "Sit," the man said, guiding her to a chair near the fire. "You need to warm up slowly or you'll make yourself sick." Elizabeth sank into the chair gratefully, her bundle still clutched in her arms. The heat from the fire was almost painful against her frozen skin, but she welcomed it. For the first time in hours, she felt like she might actually survive the night. The man moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire and putting a kettle on to boil. He didn't ask her any questions, didn't demand to know who she was or why she was wandering alone in the mountains at night. His silence was both comforting and unnerving. Elizabeth found herself studying his face in the firelight, trying to read his intentions. He had strong features, weathered by sun and wind, and his hands were scarred from years of hard work. But there was something in his eyes, a depth and intelligence that suggested he was more than just a simple mountain man. "What's your name?" Elizabeth asked finally, her voice stronger now that she was beginning to warm up. "Dennis Walker," he replied, not looking up from the pot he was stirring over the fire. "And you?" "Elizabeth Murphy." She hesitated, then added, "I was Elizabeth Murphy. I'm not sure what I am now." Dennis glanced at her then, and she saw something like understanding in his eyes. "You're someone who needs help," he said simply. "That's enough for now." He handed her a cup of something hot and fragrant, and Elizabeth wrapped her hands around it gratefully. The liquid was some kind of herbal tea, bitter but warming, and it seemed to chase away the last of the cold from her bones. As she sipped it, she found herself relaxing for the first time since her exoneed began. There was something about Dennis Walker's presence that was deeply calming, a sense of safety that she hadn't felt in months. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Dennis said, settling into a chair across from her. "But if you're running from something, I should know whether it's likely to follow you here." Elizabeth considered his words carefully. She owed him honesty, at least about the danger she might have brought to his doorstep. "I was cast out of my village," she said slowly. "They said I was cursed because I couldn't bear children. My husband left me, and the townspeople decided I was bringing bad luck to the community. Dennis's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on his own cup. And they drove you out into the mountains in winter? With stones and curses, Elizabeth confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. They said I was barren ground that would never yield fruit, that I was taking up space that could be used by someone worthy. Fools, Dennis said quietly, and there was an edge to his voice now that hadn't been there before. All of them. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, and Elizabeth found herself studying the cabin more closely. It was clearly the work of someone with considerable skill and patience. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking was neat and thorough, and everything had been built to last. Shelves lined one wall filled with books, tools, and various supplies. There was even a small area that seemed to serve as a kitchen with a wood-burning stove and carefully organized cooking implements. You built this yourself, Elizabeth said, and it wasn't really a question. Took me 3 years, Dennis replied. Started with just the foundation and worked on it whenever I had time. It's beautiful, she said, and there was something about the cabin that spoke of love and care, of someone who had put their whole heart into creating a home. Dennis looked around the room as if seeing it through her eyes. It's solid, he said, warm, safe. That's what matters up here. How long have you lived in the mountains? 5 years now. His voice was carefully neutral, but Elizabeth sensed there was a story there, perhaps not so different from her own. Did you run from something too? She asked gently. Dennis was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, I was a soldier, came back from the war and found that the world I'd left behind didn't exist anymore. The woman I'd planned to marry had moved on, my family had given me up for dead, and the town I'd grown up in felt like a foreign place. I tried to fit back in, but I couldn't. So I came here. Do you ever regret it? No, he said without hesitation. This is where I belong. The mountains don't judge you for what you've done or failed to do. They don't care about your past or your plans for the future. They only care about whether you're strong enough to survive today. Elizabeth nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. The village elders said I was useless because I couldn't fulfill a woman's primary purpose. They said I was taking the resources from families who could contribute to the community's future. A woman's worth isn't determined by her ability to bear children, Dennis said firmly. Anyone who thinks otherwise is an ignorant fool. The conviction in his voice surprised her. She had expected judgment, or at best, polite indifference. Instead, she found acceptance and even anger on her behalf. It was more kindness than she had received from anyone in months. You don't know me, she said. For all you know, they might have been right. Maybe I am cursed. I know you were brave enough to walk into unknown territory rather than give up and die, Dennis replied. I know you were polite enough to ask permission before entering my home, even though you were desperate. I know you're sitting here having a civilized conversation instead of trying to steal from me or cause trouble. That tells me more about your character than anything those villagers might have said. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, and she looked down at her hands to hide them. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such basic human decency that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. The storm's getting worse, Dennis said, apparently noticing her emotional state and choosing to give her a moment to compose herself. You can't travel in weather like this. You're welcome to stay until it passes. I don't have anything to offer in return, Elizabeth said. No money, no skills that would be useful up here. Everyone has skills, Dennis said. You just haven't discovered what yours are yet. That night, Dennis gave Elizabeth his bed and made himself a pallet on the floor near the fire. She protested, but he was firm about it, pointing out that she was still recovering from her ordeal and needed proper rest. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside and the steady sound of Dennis's breathing, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. Through the window she could see that snow had fallen during the night, covering the clearing in a pristine white blanket that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Good, you're awake, Dennis said, looking up from the stove. I was beginning to worry that you'd sleep through breakfast. Elizabeth realized that she felt better than she had in months. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a sense of energy and alertness that she had almost forgotten she was capable of feeling. "How long did I sleep?" she asked. "About 12 hours. You needed it." As they ate breakfast together, Elizabeth found herself watching Dennis with growing curiosity. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who was completely comfortable in his environment, but there were moments when she caught glimpses of something deeper, a sadness perhaps, or a loneliness that he kept carefully hidden. She wondered what his life had been like before he came to the mountains, what experiences had shaped him into the man he was now. "The snow's too deep for travel," Dennis said, as if reading her thoughts. "You'll need to stay at least another day or two." Elizabeth nodded, though part of her wondered if she would ever be ready to leave this place. The cabin felt more like home than anywhere she had lived in years, and Dennis's quiet presence was more comforting than she cared to admit. After breakfast, Dennis showed her around the property. Behind the cabin, there was a small barn where he kept a horse and a few chickens. Beyond that was a garden area, now covered in snow but clearly well tended during the growing season. Everything was neat and orderly, evidence of a man who took pride in his work and his home. "You're completely self-sufficient," Elizabeth observed. "Have to be up here," Dennis replied. "The nearest town is a 2-day ride, and that's in good weather. In winter, you might not see another soul for months." "Doesn't the isolation bother you?" Dennis considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've learned to find peace in solitude. There's something to be said for a life where you don't have to worry about other people's opinions or expectations." As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself settling into the rhythm of life in the mountains. Dennis never made her feel like an unwelcome guest or a burden. Instead, he quietly found ways for her to contribute to the daily tasks that kept them both alive and comfortable. She discovered that she had a talent for cooking, turning Dennis's simple ingredients into meals that were both nutritious and flavorful. She also proved to be skilled at mending and sewing, repairing tears in clothing, and making improvements to household items. "I told you everyone has skills," Dennis said one evening as he examined a shirt she had mended so expertly that the repair was nearly invisible. Elizabeth felt a flush of pride at his approval. It had been so long since anyone had valued her contributions that she had begun to doubt her own abilities. But here in this mountain cabin, she was discovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of disappointment and criticism. The winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin, there was warmth and comfort. Elizabeth learned to tend the fire, to care for the animals, and to preserve food for the long months ahead. Dennis taught her how to read the weather signs, how to identify edible plants, and how to move quietly through the forest. In return, she brought organization and comfort to his previously Spartan existence, creating an atmosphere of home that he had never experienced in his years of solitude. They developed an easy companionship, working together during the day and spending their evenings by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. Elizabeth learned that Dennis was far more educated than his rough appearance suggested. He had been a teacher before the war, and his collection of books reflected a wide range of interests and knowledge. In the evenings, he would sometimes read aloud to her, his deep voice bringing the words to life in the flickering firelight. "Why did you never marry?" Elizabeth asked one night, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Dennis was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I was engaged before the war," he said finally. "Sarah Mitchell. We'd known each other since childhood, planned to marry when I got back. But when I returned, she was already married to someone else. Said she'd waited as long as she could, but everyone thought I was dead." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "It was probably for the best," Dennis replied. "I wasn't the same man who had left for the war. I don't think I could have been the husband she deserved." Elizabeth wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that any woman would be lucky to have a man like him, but she kept the words to herself. She was beginning to understand that Dennis, like herself, carried wounds that went deeper than the surface, scars that would take time and patience to heal. As winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, Elizabeth realized that she was facing a decision that she had been avoiding. The snow was melting, the passes would soon be clear, and she would have to choose whether to leave the safety and comfort of Dennis's cabin to try to make a new life somewhere else. The thought filled her with a mixture of fear and sadness that she didn't want to examine too closely. "Spring's coming early this year," Dennis said one morning as they watched the icicles dripping from the eaves of the cabin. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She knew what he was really saying. Soon she would be able to travel again, and their strange, peaceful interlude would come to an end. "I've been thinking," Dennis continued, his voice carefully casual. "This place is big enough for two people, more than big enough, really, and there's plenty of work to keep both of us busy." Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you wanted to stay, you'd be welcome, permanently, I mean. We work well together, and I think we've both found something here that we didn't know we were looking for." Elizabeth stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would want that? Even knowing what I am? What I can't give you?" Dennis turned to face her fully, his expression serious and intent. "Elizabeth, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking you to stay because I pity you or because I think you owe me something. I'm asking because in the months you've been here, this place has become more of a home than it ever was when I lived here alone. You've brought something to my life that I didn't even realize was missing." "But I can't have children," Elizabeth said, the words coming out in a rush. "I can't give you a family or carry on your name or any of the things a wife is supposed to do." "A home isn't just about children," Dennis said gently. "It's about two people choosing to build a life together, to face whatever comes with someone standing beside them. If children come, that's a blessing. If they don't, that doesn't make the love or the partnership any less valuable." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "You really mean that?" "I've never meant anything more in my life," Dennis said. "This cabin was just a shelter before you came. Now it's a home. We can fill it with love, with laughter, with all the things that make life worth living. Children would be wonderful, but they're not the only way to create a meaningful life together." Elizabeth looked around the cabin that had become so dear to her, at the man who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had turned its back on her, and she knew that her wandering was over. She had found her place, her purpose, and her peace. So, "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I want to stay." Dennis's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance, making him look younger and happier than she had ever seen him. He crossed the room and took her hands in his touch gentle and reverent. "Then we'll build something beautiful together," he said, "something that will last." The wedding took place on a warm spring morning with only the mountains as witnesses. Dennis had ridden down to the distant town to fetch a traveling preacher, a grizzled old man named Charles Wood, who asked no questions about their circumstances and seemed genuinely pleased to perform the ceremony. Elizabeth wore her one good dress, carefully mended and cleaned, with wildflowers in her hair that Dennis had picked for her from the meadow behind the cabin. "Do you, Dennis Walker, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Dennis said, his voice strong and sure, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. "And do you, Elizabeth Murphy, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Elizabeth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They had no rings, but Dennis had carved two simple bands from mountain laurel wood, smooth and beautiful in their simplicity. As they exchanged these tokens of their commitment, Elizabeth felt a sense of completion that she had never experienced before. She was no longer the barren woman who had been cast out of her village. She was Dennis's wife, a partner in building a life that would be rich in ways that had nothing to do with children. After the preacher had gone, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, looking out over the valley that spread below them. The snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, and the meadows were green with new grass and dotted with wildflowers. It was a view that never failed to take Elizabeth's breath away, a reminder of the beauty and peace they had found together. No regrets? Dennis asked, slipping his arm around her waist. None, Elizabeth said firmly. This is where I belong. As spring turned to summer, they worked together to expand and improve their home. Dennis built an addition to the cabin that would serve as Elizabeth's sewing room, complete with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Elizabeth planted a garden that was twice the size of Dennis's original plot, filling it with vegetables, herbs, and flowers that would provide both sustenance and beauty throughout the growing season. They developed a routine that suited both of their natures. Dennis would spend his mornings hunting or working on the various construction projects that were always needed to maintain their mountain home. Elizabeth would tend to the garden, the animals, and the household tasks that kept their life running smoothly. In the afternoons, they would often work together, whether it was preserving food for winter, making repairs to equipment, or simply enjoying each other's company. Their evenings were Elizabeth's favorite time of day. They would sit by the fire, Dennis reading aloud from one of his many books while Elizabeth worked on her sewing or mending. Sometimes they would talk about their plans for the future, the improvements they wanted to make to the property, or the places they might visit when the weather was good. Other times they would simply enjoy the comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but aware of the other's presence. I've been thinking about getting some sheep, Dennis said one evening as they sat watching the sunset from their porch. Sheep? Elizabeth asked, looking up from the shirt she was hemming. For wool, Dennis explained. You're so talented with needle and thread, and if we had our own source of wool, you could make clothes for trade as well as for our own use. There's always demand for quality garments in the settlements. Elizabeth considered the idea, her mind already working through the possibilities. It would mean more work, caring for the animals, and processing the wool. But it would also mean more independence, Dennis pointed out, and I think you'd enjoy it. You have a gift for creating beautiful things. The compliment warmed Elizabeth more than she cared to admit. Dennis had a way of seeing potential in her that she had never recognized in herself. Under his encouragement, she had discovered the talents and abilities that had been buried under years of criticism and disappointment. All right, she said, let's try it. That autumn, Dennis made the long journey to a distant ranch and returned with a small flock of sheep and a border collie named Patricia Brooks to help manage them. Elizabeth threw herself into learning everything she could about wool production, from shearing and cleaning to spinning and dyeing. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the work, and soon she was producing yarn of such quality that Dennis could trade it in town for supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves. The success of their sheep venture led to other expansions of their little homestead. They added more chickens, a milk cow, and eventually a second horse so that Elizabeth could accompany Dennis on some of his trips to town. Each addition to their property felt like another step toward the self-sufficient life they were building together. But it wasn't just their material circumstances that were improving. Elizabeth could feel herself changing, growing stronger and more confident with each passing season. The frightened, broken woman who had stumbled into Dennis's clearing that winter night was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim her place in the world. You're different, Dennis observed one day as they worked together in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before the first frost. Different how? Elizabeth asked, though she thought she knew what he meant. Stronger, more sure of yourself. When you first came here, you acted like you were apologizing for taking up space. Now you move through the world like you belong in it. Elizabeth straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands, and considered his words. I feel different, she admitted. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do. And what's that? Elizabeth gestured to the garden around them, to the cabin that had become their home, to the life they had built together with their own hands and hearts. This, building something meaningful with someone who sees me as I really am, not as what other people think I should be. Dennis smiled and pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. I love who you really are, he said softly. Every stubborn, talented, beautiful part of you. Winter came early that second year, but Elizabeth no longer feared it. Their cabin was warm and well-stocked, their animals were healthy and protected, and they had each other. As the snow began to fall, she felt only a sense of cozy anticipation for the quiet months ahead when they would have time to focus on indoor projects and simply enjoy each other's company. It was during one of those peaceful winter evenings that they heard the yaks barking in the distance. Patricia Brooks, who had been sleeping by the fire, suddenly lifted her head and growled low in her throat. Dennis immediately reached for the rifle that always hung above the fireplace. "Stay inside," he told Elizabeth, but she was already moving toward the window to peer out into the darkness. "There are lights," she said. "Torches, I think. Coming up the trail." Dennis joined her at the window, his expression grim. 3 men, maybe 4. They're not traveling light. Elizabeth's blood ran cold as she recognized the implications. Travelers in winter didn't come this far into the mountains unless they had a very specific purpose. And given her history, she could think of only one reason why men with torches would be seeking them out. "They've come for me," she said quietly. Dennis looked at her sharply. "What makes you think that? Who else would be looking for us up here? Someone must have seen me in town on one of our trips, recognized me, and told the others where I was. They've come to finish what they started." Dennis's jaw tightened, and Elizabeth could see the anger building in his eyes. "No one is taking you anywhere," he said firmly. "This is your home, and I'll defend it." The sound of voices grew closer, and soon they could make out individual words being shouted through the wind and snow. "Walker! Dennis Walker! We know you're in there!" Dennis opened the door but kept his rifle ready. "What do you want?" 3 men emerged from the darkness, their faces hard and determined in the torchlight. Elizabeth recognized them as townspeople from her old village, men who had been among the loudest voices calling for her exile. "We've come for the woman," said the leader, a man named Tyler Murphy who had been one of her husband's friends. "She belongs to us." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Dennis replied coldly. "She's my wife, and this is her home." Tyler Murphy laughed harshly. "Your wife? You married that Barren witch? Do you have any idea what she is? What she's brought upon everyone she's ever known?" "I know exactly who she is," Dennis said, his voice steady and dangerous. "She's a woman of courage and strength who was driven from her home by ignorant cowards, and she's under my protection." "Protection?" Another of the men, Betty Howard's husband, John Roberts, spat in the snow. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into, Walker. That woman is cursed. Every community she's ever been part of has suffered for it. Crops have failed, children have died, misfortune has followed in her wake like a plague." Elizabeth felt the familiar stab of pain at his words, but this time it was accompanied by anger. She had spent too many months discovering her own worth to let these men destroy her confidence now. "That's not true," she said, stepping up beside Dennis. "You're blaming me for things that have nothing to do with me. Bad weather, disease, accidents, they happen everywhere. I'm not responsible for every misfortune that's ever befallen our village." "Aren't you?" Tyler Murphy's eyes glittered with malice. "Then explain why the Henderson baby died the week after you were married. Explain why the miller's barn burned down the month you moved into your husband's house. Explain why we had 3 years of poor harvests while you lived among us." "I can't explain those things because they don't need explaining," Elizabeth shot back, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Bad things happen to good people all the time. That's life, not a curse. Okay? You've spent so much time looking for someone to blame that you've forgotten how to take responsibility for your own problems." Dennis stepped forward, placing himself between Elizabeth and the 3 men. "You've had your say. Now get off my property." "We're not leaving without her," Tyler Murphy said. "The town council has voted. She's to be brought back to face judgment for the crimes she's committed." "What crimes?" Dennis demanded. "Being unable to have children? That's not a crime. It's a medical condition." "Witchcraft," John Roberts said flatly. "Bringing curses upon innocent people, corrupting the natural order." Dennis actually laughed at that, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Witchcraft? You rode 2 days through a blizzard to accuse my wife of witchcraft? Are you completely insane?" "We have evidence," Tyler Murphy insisted. "Testimony from people who've seen her strange behavior, witnessed the misfortunes that follow in her wake." "You have superstition and scapegoating," Dennis replied. "Nothing more, and I'm telling you for the last time to get off my land." The third man, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "We didn't come here to negotiate, Walker. We came to collect what belongs to us. If you try to stop us, you'll regret it. Dennis raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at the men but making his intentions clear. The only thing you're going to collect is a bullet if you don't turn around and leave. This woman is my wife, a citizen of this territory, and she's committed no crime. You have no legal authority to take her anywhere. Legal authority? Tyler Murphy sneered. We don't need legal authority to deal with a witch. Some things are more important than the law. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. She had hoped that her marriage to Dennis and their isolated life in the mountains would protect her from the hatred and superstition of her former community. But it seemed that some people's need to have someone to blame was stronger than time or distance. Dennis, she said quietly, placing a hand on his arm, maybe I should go with them. I don't want you to be hurt because of me. Dennis turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes was fierce and protective. You're not going anywhere with these men. This is your home, Elizabeth. Our home. And no one has the right to take you from it. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Dennis holding his rifle steady and the three men from the village shifting restlessly in the snow. Elizabeth could feel the situation escalating toward violence, and the thought terrified her. She had found peace and happiness in this mountain home, but she couldn't bear the idea of Dennis being hurt or killed because of her past. Please, she said, addressing the men directly, I understand that you blame me for things that have gone wrong in your lives, but taking me back won't solve your problems. The crops will still fail sometimes, people will still get sick, accidents will still happen. That's the nature of life, not the result of any curse. Pretty words, Tyler Murphy said, but we've seen the evidence of what you are. The town needs to be cleansed of your influence once and for all. What influence? Elizabeth demanded, her fear giving way to anger. I haven't set foot in your village for over a year. I've been here in these mountains, building a life with my husband. How exactly am I supposed to be cursing your crops from 100 miles away? The men exchanged glances, and Elizabeth could see that her logic was making them uncomfortable. Their accusations didn't hold up under scrutiny, and they knew it. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that they had made the particularly dangerous journey for nothing. Witchcraft doesn't respect distance, John Roberts said, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that you're looking for someone to blame for your own failures, Dennis said coldly. It's easier to persecute an innocent woman than to admit that sometimes life is hard and unfair for no reason at all. Innocent? Tyler Murphy's voice rose. She destroyed her own marriage. Her own husband couldn't stand to live with her. Elizabeth flinched at the words, but Dennis stepped closer to the men, his rifle now clearly aimed in their direction. Her husband was a coward who abandoned his wife when she needed him most, Dennis said, his voice deadly quiet, just like all of you. You're so threatened by anything you don't understand that you'd rather destroy it than learn from it. You don't know what you're talking about, John Roberts protested. You didn't live with her curse hanging over your head every day. I've lived with her for over a year, Dennis replied. And in that time, we've had good harvests, healthy animals, and more happiness than either of us had ever known before. If she's cursed, then I hope it's contagious. Elizabeth felt a surge of love and gratitude toward her husband that was so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. He was risking his life to defend her, not just from physical harm, but from the psychological damage these men were trying to inflict. He saw her as she really was, not as the monster they had created in their minds. You're both mad, Tyler Murphy said, but Elizabeth could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The whole mountain has made you both mad. The only madness here is yours, Dennis said. 3 grown men riding through a blizzard to terrorize a woman who's never done anything worse than fail to conceive a child. You should be ashamed of yourselves. The wind picked up, driving snow into their faces and making the torches flicker wildly. Elizabeth could see that the men were cold and tired, and their initial confidence was beginning to waver. They had expected to find her alone and defenseless, not protected by a man who was clearly willing to fight for her. This isn't over, Tyler Murphy said finally, but the threat sounded hollow. The town won't forget what she is. Then the town will continue to be a place of ignorance and cruelty, Dennis replied, and my wife and I will continue to be grateful that we don't have to live there. The three men began to back away, their torches casting dancing shadows on the snow. Elizabeth watched them go with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the immediate danger was over, but sadness that people she had once considered friends and neighbors could harbor such hatred for her. "Will they come back?" she asked Dennis as the lights disappeared into the darkness. "Maybe," Dennis said honestly, "but if they do, they'll find us ready for Barren." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that their peaceful isolation might be coming to an end. Word would spread about their confrontation, and there might be others who shared Tyler Murphy's beliefs about her supposed curse. But as she looked at Dennis, still standing protectively beside her with his rifle in his hands, she felt a strength and determination that she had never possessed before. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what people think of me or what they might do to me." Dennis smiled and pulled her close. "Good, because you have nothing to be afraid of. You're not the broken woman who stumbled into this clearing a year ago. You're strong now, Elizabeth. Strong enough to face whatever comes." As they went back inside the warm cabin, Elizabeth reflected on how much her life had changed. The frightened, desperate woman who had been driven from her village was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. She had found not just a home in these mountains, but herself. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow sparkling in the sunlight. Dennis was up early, checking the perimeter of their property and making sure the men from the village had truly gone. Elizabeth busied herself with the morning chores, feeding the animals and preparing breakfast, but her mind was on the events of the previous night. "Do you think they were right about one thing?" she asked Dennis as they sat down to eat. "Do you think I really did bring bad luck to the village?" Dennis looked at her seriously. "Elizabeth, do you remember what the weather was like the year before you were married?" Elizabeth thought back. It was a drought year, the worst in decades. "And you were unmarried then, living with your parents? If you were really cursed, wouldn't the drought have been your fault too?" Elizabeth blinked, realizing she had never thought about it that way. "I suppose it would have been. But no one blamed you then, did they? Because you hadn't been marked as different yet. It was only after your marriage failed that people started looking for someone to blame for every misfortune." Dennis reached across the table and took her hand. "Bad things happen, Elizabeth. Crops fail, people die, accidents occur. It's the human condition, not the result of supernatural forces. Those men last night were looking for a scapegoat, not justice, Juan." Elizabeth felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For years, she had wondered if there might be some truth to the accusations, if she really was somehow responsible for the misfortunes that seemed to follow her. But Dennis's logic was unassailable. Bad luck had existed in the village long before she was married, and it would continue long after she was gone. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of renewal and possibility. Elizabeth threw herself into preparing the garden, expanding it even further and adding new varieties of vegetables and herbs. She had become an accomplished gardener under Dennis's tutelage, and their small homestead was becoming increasingly self-sufficient. One morning, as she was working in the garden, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart jumped, remembering the visit from the men the previous winter, but when she looked up, she saw a single rider, a woman dressed in practical traveling clothes. "Hello," the woman called out as she dismounted. "I'm looking for Elizabeth Walker." Elizabeth straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm Elizabeth Walker." The woman smiled and extended her hand. "My name is Nancy Garcia. I've ridden a long way to meet you." Elizabeth shook the offered hand, curious and a little wary. "What can I do for you?" "I've heard about your needlework," Nancy said, "about the beautiful clothes you make and the quality of your wool. I represent several families in the territorial capital, and they're willing to pay very well for custom garments." Elizabeth stared at her in surprise. "How did you hear about my work?" "Your husband has been trading in the settlements, and word gets around about quality goods. I've seen some of the pieces he's sold, and they're extraordinary. Better than anything we can get from the Eastern manufacturers." Dennis emerged from the barn, having heard the voices. Nancy Garcia introduced herself and explained her business proposition. She was essentially offering to become their agent, connecting Elizabeth's work with customers who could afford to pay premium prices for custom clothing. There's a real market for what you do, Nancy explained, especially among the wives of territorial officials and successful businessmen. They want quality garments that are well-made and unique, not the mass-produced items that are starting to flood the market. Elizabeth looked at Dennis, who nodded encouragingly. It sounds like an excellent opportunity, he said. You've certainly got the skill for it. Over the next few hours, they worked out the details of an arrangement that would allow Elizabeth to take custom orders for clothing while still maintaining their mountain lifestyle. Nancy would serve as the intermediary, taking orders and delivering finished goods, while Elizabeth would work from her home studio. There's one thing I should mention, Nancy said as she prepared to leave. Some of the people who will be buying your clothes are the same ones who've heard the stories about you from your old village. They don't care about any of that nonsense, but I thought you should know. Elizabeth felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of confidence. Let them hear the stories, she said. My work will speak for itself. Nancy smiled approvingly. That's exactly the right attitude. In my experience, success is the best response to gossip. After Nancy Garcia left, Elizabeth and Dennis spent the evening discussing the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. The prospect of building a real business around her skills was exciting, but it also meant that their quiet, isolated life might become more complicated. Are you sure you want to do this? Dennis asked. Once word spreads that you're taking custom orders, we might have a steady stream of visitors. Our privacy will be gone. Elizabeth considered his words carefully. Part of her was tempted to maintain their peaceful isolation, to continue living quietly without drawing attention to themselves. But another part of her was tired of hiding, tired of letting other people's prejudices dictate how she lived her life. I think I do want to do this, she said finally. For too long, I've let fear control my choices. I've hidden away, trying to make myself invisible so that no one could hurt me. But that's not really living, is it? Dennis smiled and pulled her into his arms. No, it's not. And you deserve to live fully, to use your talents and be proud of what you can accomplish. Omanis, Elizabeth added with a grin. If we're going to fill this house with love, we might as well fill it with purpose too. The first custom order arrived within a month, a request for a wedding dress from the daughter of a territorial judge. Elizabeth threw herself into the project with enthusiasm, creating a gown that was both elegant and practical, suitable for a frontier wedding, but beautiful enough for any occasion. When Nancy Garcia delivered the finished dress, the response was overwhelmingly positive, leading to several more orders almost immediately. As word of Elizabeth's skill spread, their mountain home began to see a steady trickle of visitors. Some were customers coming to discuss custom orders. Others were simply curious about the woman who had become something of a legend in the territory. Elizabeth discovered that she enjoyed meeting these new people, sharing her knowledge and skills, and building connections beyond their isolated valley. You're becoming famous, Dennis observed one evening after a particularly busy day that had seen 3 different visitors. Is that a bad thing? Elizabeth asked, though she was smiling. Not at all. I'm proud of you, Elizabeth. You've taken something that was meant to shame you, your supposed barrenness, and turned it into freedom. Freedom to pursue your talents, to build something meaningful, to define yourself on your own terms. Elizabeth looked around their cabin, now expanded to include a proper workshop where she could meet with customers and display her work. The walls were lined with examples of her craftsmanship, from simple everyday garments to elaborate formal wear. It was a far cry from the sparse, utilitarian dwelling Dennis had maintained as a bachelor. We really have filled it with love, haven't we? She said softly. In every way that matters, Dennis agreed. That night, as they sat by the fire reading together, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. She had been cast out as worthless, labeled as cursed and barren, driven from her home by people who saw her only as a failure. But in losing everything she thought she wanted, she had found everything she actually needed. She had found a partner who valued her for who she was rather than what she could produce. She had discovered talents and strengths she never knew she possessed. She had built a home that was truly hers, filled with love and purpose and the satisfaction of meaningful work. Most importantly, she had found herself. The woman she was now bore little resemblance to the broken, desperate creature who had stumbled into Dennis's clearing that winter night. She was strong, confident, and unafraid to claim her place in the world. As their second anniversary approached, Dennis surprised Elizabeth with a proposal that took her breath away. "I want to build you a proper workshop," he said one morning over breakfast. "Not just an addition to the cabin, but a separate building where you can really spread out, where customers can come without disturbing our private space." Elizabeth stared at him in amazement. "Dennis, that would be wonderful, but it would be so much work, so much expense." "We can afford it now," Dennis pointed out. "Your business has been more successful than either of us imagined. And I want to do this for you, Elizabeth. I want to build you something that's entirely yours, a place where you can create and teach and be the artist you have become." The workshop Dennis built for Elizabeth was more beautiful and functional than anything she could have imagined. It had large windows that let in plenty of natural light, built-in storage for fabrics and supplies, and a comfortable area where she could meet with customers. But the feature that touched her most deeply was the sign Dennis had carved and hung above the door. "Elizabeth Walker, Master Seamstress." "Master Seamstress?" Elizabeth asked, running her fingers over the carefully carved letters. "That's what you are," Dennis said simply. "You've mastered your craft, and you deserve to be recognized for it." The workshop became the center of a small but thriving business that brought people from across the territory to their mountain home. Elizabeth found herself not just creating custom garments, but teaching other women the skills they needed to clothe their families well. She began offering classes in sewing, embroidery, and fabric dyeing, turning their homestead into an informal school for domestic arts. "You're changing lives," Dennis observed one evening after a particularly successful class that had drawn women from 3 different settlements. "How do you mean?" Elizabeth asked. "You're teaching them that they don't have to accept inferior goods, that they can create beautiful things with their own hands. You're giving them skills that will serve them for the rest of their lives." Elizabeth had never thought about her work in those terms, but she realized Dennis was right. Many of the women who came to her classes had never been taught proper sewing techniques, had never learned to see fabric and thread as materials for artistic expression rather than mere necessity. She was giving them tools for self-sufficiency and creative fulfillment. One day, a familiar face appeared at her workshop door. It was Catherine Jackson, a woman from her old village who had been among the quieter voices during Elizabeth's exile. She looked nervous and uncertain, clearly unsure of her welcome. "Elizabeth," Catherine said hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind my coming here." "Of course not," Elizabeth replied, though she was curious about what had brought Catherine so far from home. "Please, come in." Catherine entered the workshop slowly, her eyes taking in the displays of beautiful garments and the obvious prosperity of the business. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, "for what happened to you in the village, for not speaking up when I should have." Elizabeth studied the other woman's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "What's changed your mind?" "Everything," Catherine said with a bitter laugh. "The crops have been just as unreliable since you left as they were when you lived among us. People still get sick, accidents still happen, life is still hard, but now we don't have anyone to blame but ourselves." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. "And how is that working out?" "It isn't. The community is falling apart. People are leaving, families are feuding, and the men who drove you away are still looking for someone else to blame for their problems." "I'm sorry to hear that," Elizabeth said, and meant it. Despite everything that had happened, she didn't wish ill on her former neighbors. "Are you?" Catherine asked, seeming surprised. "After the way we treated you?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "I'm sorry that people I once cared about are suffering, but I'm not sorry that I was forced to leave. If I hadn't been driven out, I never would have found this life, this place, this happiness. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened." Catherine looked around the workshop again, taking in the evidence of Elizabeth's success and contentment. "You've done well for yourself." "We've done well for ourselves," Elizabeth corrected, thinking of Dennis and all they had built together. "My husband and I have created something beautiful here." "The mountain man," Catherine said, and there was a note of curiosity in her voice. "Is he good to you?" Elizabeth smiled, thinking of all the ways Dennis had shown his love and support over the years. He sees me as I really am, not as what other people think I should be. He values my contributions and encourages my dreams. He's my partner in every sense of the word. Catherine nodded slowly. I'm glad. You deserve happiness, Elizabeth. You always did. After Catherine left, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the conversation for days. It was gratifying to know that at least one person from her past had come to understand the injustice of her treatment. But more than that, it made her realize how completely she had moved beyond the pain of her exile. The woman who had once defined herself by her inability to have children was gone, replaced by someone who had found purpose and fulfillment in entirely different ways. That evening, she shared the conversation with Dennis, who listened thoughtfully. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they hadn't driven you out? He asked. Elizabeth considered the question. Sometimes, but I don't think I would have been happy even if I had been allowed to stay. I was trying so hard to be what other people wanted me to be that I never had the chance to discover who I really was. And now you know? Elizabeth looked around their home, filled with evidence of the life they had built together, the work she had created, the love they shared. Now I know that I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be, living exactly the life I'm meant to live. The third year of their marriage brought new challenges and new opportunities. Elizabeth's reputation as a master seamstress had spread throughout the territory, and she found herself with more orders than she could handle alone. The solution came in the form of two young women from a nearby settlement who approached her about becoming apprentices. We can't pay much, said the older of the two, a serious young woman named Betty Howard. But we're willing to work hard and learn everything you can teach us. Elizabeth looked at the two young women, seeing something of her younger self in their eager faces. What made you want to learn this trade? We want to be able to support ourselves, Betty Howard said frankly. We don't want to have to depend on finding husbands to take care of us. We want to have skills that will let us make our own way in the world. Elizabeth smiled, remembering her own journey toward independence and self-sufficiency. That's exactly the right reason. When can you start? Having apprentices changed the dynamic of Elizabeth's work in ways she hadn't expected. She found that she enjoyed teaching, sharing not just the technical skills of sewing and design, but the confidence and self-respect that came with mastering a valuable craft. Betty Howard and her friend Patricia Brooks proved to be dedicated students, and within months they were producing work of professional quality. You're building something bigger than just a business, Dennis observed one evening as they watched the two young women working late in the workshop, determined to finish a difficult order on time. You're creating a legacy. Elizabeth hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she realized he was right. She was passing on skills and knowledge that would serve these young women for the rest of their lives, just as other women might pass on knowledge to their daughters. In a way, she was mothering, nurturing, and guiding the next generation, even though she had never given birth. The success of her apprenticeship program led to other innovations. Elizabeth began organizing what she called skill exchanges, gatherings where women from different settlements could come together to share knowledge about various domestic arts. One woman might teach soap making, while another demonstrated cheese making or herb cultivation. Elizabeth provided the organizing structure and the meeting place, creating a network of women who supported and learned from each other. You've become the center of something important, Nancy Garcia told her during one of her regular visits. These women look up to you, Elizabeth. You're showing them that they can be more than just wives and mothers, that they can have identities and purposes of their own. Elizabeth was touched by Nancy's words, but also a little overwhelmed by the responsibility they implied. I never set out to be a leader or a teacher. I just wanted to survive, to find a place where I could be myself. That's exactly why you're so effective, Nancy replied. You're not preaching to them about what they should do with their lives. You're showing them what's possible by living your own life fully and authentically. As the fourth year of their marriage began, Elizabeth realized that their mountain home had become something neither she nor Dennis had originally envisioned. What had started as a refuge for two people seeking solitude had evolved into a center of learning and community, a place where women came to develop skills, confidence, and connections with each other. Do you miss the quiet life we used to have? Elizabeth asked Dennis one particularly busy day when their property had hosted a dozen visitors, all there for various business or educational purposes. Dennis considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the simplicity, he admitted, but I don't miss the emptiness. This place has purpose now, meaning beyond just our own survival and happiness. We're contributing something valuable to the world. Even though it means less privacy, less time for just the two of us, Dennis pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Elizabeth, when I asked you to stay here with me, I said we would fill this place with love. I had no idea how many different forms that love would take. We have love between us as husband and wife, but we also have love for the work we do, love for the people we serve, love for the community we've helped create. This place is fuller of love than I ever imagined possible. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the truth of his words. They had indeed filled their home with love, but not in the way either of them had originally expected. Instead of children, they had students and customers and friends. Instead of a traditional family, they had created an extended community of people who supported and cared for each other. That night, as they sat by the fire in the quiet hours after their visitors had gone, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. She thought about the frightened, broken woman who had stumbled into this clearing 4 years ago, convinced that she was worthless because she couldn't fulfill society's expectations of what a woman should be. That woman was gone now, transformed not by some magical cure for her barrenness, but by the discovery that there were many ways to be valuable, many ways to contribute, many ways to create a meaningful life. She had learned that love came in many forms, that family could be defined in many ways, and that home was not a place but a feeling of belonging and purpose. Do you know what I realized today? Elizabeth said to Dennis as they prepared for bed. What's that? I'm not barren at all. I may not have given birth to children, but I've given birth to dreams, to possibilities, to new ways of thinking about what a woman can be and do. I've nurtured talents in myself and others. I've created beauty and meaning and connection. In all the ways that truly matter, I've been incredibly fertile. Dennis smiled and kissed her forehead gently. You've always been fertile, Elizabeth. It just took the right soil for your gifts to grow. 5 years after Elizabeth had first stumbled into Dennis's mountain clearing, their homestead had become legendary throughout the territory. People spoke of the woman who had been cast out as cursed and had built an empire of beauty and skill in the wilderness. They talked about the mountain man who had seen her true worth when no one else could, and the love story that had grown into something much larger than either of them. Elizabeth stood in her workshop one morning, looking out at the valley that had become her world. The view never failed to take her breath away, but now it held even more meaning. This was the place where she had discovered who she really was, where she had learned to value herself, where she had found love in all its many forms. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie, and she turned to see a young woman standing hesitantly in the doorway. She was clearly from one of the settlements, her clothes well made but showing signs of hard travel. But it was the expression on her face that caught Elizabeth's attention, a look of desperation and hope that she recognized all too well. Are you Elizabeth Walker? The young woman asked. I am. How can I help you? The young woman stepped into the workshop, her eyes wide as she took in the displays, beautiful garments, and the obvious prosperity of the business. My name is Katherine Jackson. I've come because I heard that you help women who have nowhere else to turn. Elizabeth studied the young woman's face, seeing the same fear and uncertainty that she herself had once carried. What kind of help do you need? Katherine Jackson's story was heartbreakingly familiar. She had been married young to a man who had turned out to be cruel and violent. When she had failed to conceive children quickly enough to suit him, he had begun to blame her for everything that went wrong in their lives. The community had sided with him, as communities often did, and Catherine had found herself increasingly isolated and desperate. I finally couldn't take it anymore, Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. I ran away in the night, but I have nowhere to go, no skills to support myself. I heard that you might understand, that you might be willing to help. Elizabeth felt her heart go out to this young woman who was facing the same kind of rejection and abandonment that she herself had experienced. But she also felt a surge of confidence and purpose that she never would have had in her earlier life. "You've come to the right place," Elizabeth said firmly. "We'll find you a place to stay, and if you're willing to work and learn, we'll teach you skills that will let you support yourself for the rest of your life." Over the following weeks, Katherine Jackson became part of the extended community that had grown up around Elizabeth's homestead. She proved to be a quick learner and a dedicated worker, and Elizabeth saw in her the same transformation that she herself had undergone. The frightened, desperate woman gradually gave way to someone who was confident and capable, someone who knew her own worth. "It's like watching myself 5 years ago," Elizabeth told Dennis one evening as they watched Catherine working in the garden with some of the other women who had found refuge and purpose at their homestead. "Except that you're the one providing the guidance and support now," Dennis pointed out. "You've become the person you needed when you first arrived here." Elizabeth realized that he was right. She had not only survived her own ordeal, but she had transformed it into something that could help others. The pain and rejection she had experienced had given her the empathy and understanding needed to help other women facing similar challenges. As the sun set over the mountains that had become her home, Elizabeth reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. She had been cast out as barren, worthless, a burden on her community. But in losing everything she thought she wanted, she had found everything she actually needed. She had discovered that there were many ways to be fertile, many ways to nurture and create and contribute to the world. Dennis joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist as they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "Any regrets?" he asked, the same question he had posed on their birthday day. Elizabeth looked around at the life they had built together, at the community of women who had found purpose and belonging under their guidance, at the love that filled every corner of their mountain home. "None," she said, and meant it completely. "This is exactly the life I was meant to live." "Even though it's not the life you originally planned?" Elizabeth smiled, thinking of the young woman she had been, so focused on fulfilling other people's expectations that she had never stopped to consider what she actually wanted from life. "Especially because it's not the life I originally planned," she said. "The life I planned was small and narrow, defined by what other people thought I should be. This life is vast and rich and full of possibilities I never could have imagined." Dennis pulled her closer, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over their mountain home. In the distance, they could hear the sound of women's voices, laughing and talking as they finished their evening tasks. It was the sound of community, of belonging, of lives being lived with purpose and joy. Elizabeth thought about the village that had cast her out, wondered if the people there had ever realized that their cruelty had not destroyed her, but had instead set her free to become everything she was meant to be. She hoped that someday they would understand that true worth was not measured by the ability to fulfill a single biological function, but by the capacity to love, to create, to contribute, to grow. "We really did fill it with love," she said softly, echoing the promise Dennis had made to her on that first night when she had been nothing but a frightened, desperate woman seeking shelter from the storm. "In ways we never could have imagined," Dennis agreed. As they went inside their warm, welcoming home, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place. She had been broken and rebuilt, lost and found, rejected and embraced. She had learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the doorway to the best life you never knew was possible. The woman who had once been called Barren had indeed filled her home with love, with purpose, with meaning, and with the knowledge that worth is not determined by others, but discovered within oneself. In the end, that was the greatest fertility of all.